Chapter 18 of Stories of Old Greece and Rome by Emilie Kipp Baker. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 18 Neptune and the Sea Gods. In the days when the Titans ruled the universe, Oceanus, with his wife Tethys, controlled all the lakes, rivers, and seas. But when the Titans were overthrown, Neptune took possession of this great kingdom, and old Oceanus reluctantly gave up his dominion over the waters of the earth. Though anxious to assert his supreme authority, Neptune allowed some of the descendants of the Titans to keep their small kingdoms, on condition that they own allegiance to him as their ruler. Among these was Nereus, son of Oceanus, who was celebrated for his vast knowledge, his gift of prophecy, and his love of truth and justice. He and his wife Doris, also a child of Oceanus, had 50 daughters called Nereids, and they were so beautiful that Neptune chose one of them named Amphitrite for his wife. There were 2 others of the Nereids who became famous: Galatea, beloved by the Cyclops Polyphemus, and Thetis, the mother of Achilles, but none of them equaled Amphitrite in beauty. When Neptune first went wooing the Nereid, she was frightened by his formidable appearance, for he drove in a chariot drawn by huge sea horses with brazen hoofs and golden manes, and the god himself carried his terrible trident, or 3-pronged spear, with which he shatters rocks and commands the storms and shakes the shores of the earth. None knew better than Amphitrite the extent of Neptune's power, for she had often watched him, when a storm was at its height, raise his all-compelling trident, and immediately the waves would cease raging, and there would be a great calm. Sometimes she saw a ship doomed by the sea god to disaster, gliding confidently in quiet waters, when all at once a fierce storm would break over its head, and the hapless sailors, as they breasted the angry waves, would pray vainly to Neptune for the help that would never come. Many a good ship had nearly gained her port when he spake, and round about him called the clouds, and roused the ocean, wielding in his hand the trident, summoned all the hurricanes of all the winds, and covered earth and sky at once with mists, while from above the night fell suddenly. Odyssey, Book 5, line 348. Bryant's translation. When Amphitrite saw this imposing-looking god driving towards her, she was frightened by so much splendor, though she could not help admiring Neptune himself, with his sea-green beard and his long flowing hair crowned with shells and seaweed. Since the enamored god could never come near enough to plead his suit, he sent one of his dolphins to do the wooing, and this was so successful that the fair Nereid was persuaded to become Neptune's wife, and share his golden throne in the heart of the sea. To reward the dolphin for its skill in having won him his much-desired bride, Neptune placed it in the sky, where it forms a well-known constellation. Though Neptune had undisputed control over all the waters of the earth, and over all that moves through the paths of the sea, he once aspired to greater power, and even plotted to dethrone Jupiter. But the ruler of gods and men discovered his wicked plans, and to punish him deprived him of his kingdom for some years, during which time he was obliged to submit to the humiliation of serving Laomedon, king of Troy. It was while he was in the service here that he sought Apollo's help in building the wall of Troy, whose stones fell into place under the spell of the sun god's music. Laomedon had promised Neptune a large reward if the wall was built within a certain time, but when it was finished he refused to pay the sum agreed upon. Though angered by this treachery, Neptune had to endure the king's injustice until his years of service were over, but as soon as he was restored to his former power, he created a terrible sea monster, which spread terror and death all over the land. Not knowing how to meet this calamity, the Trojans consulted an oracle, and were advised to sacrifice to the monster a beautiful maiden each year, and so prevent the wrath of Neptune from overwhelming the whole country in disaster. Reluctantly the sorrowing people prepared to obey the oracle, and a victim was chosen by lot, and led by the priest to a large rock on the seashore, where she was securely chained. Then the hideous sea beast glided out of its cave in the slimy rocks and devoured her. Each year this terrible ceremony was repeated, and at last the lot fell upon Hesione, the king's only daughter. Laomedon tried in vain to save her, but the lot was cast, and nothing could avert the appointed sacrifice. In despair the wretched father saw the fatal hour approaching, and when the day drew near when Hesione was to be led down to the sea, he forgot his avarice and proclaimed throughout the land that a great reward would be given to any one who could slay the monster. Hercules appeared just in time to save the doomed maiden, and killed the monster with his oaken club as it was dragging Hesione into its cave. The king was overjoyed at his daughter's rescue, and told Hercules that he might claim the reward. But even when he saw the hero come with the beast's head as a proof that he had slain it, he refused to part with his much loved gold. So Hercules returned home, but he did not forget Laomedon's perfidy, and when later on he came again to Troy, he killed the king and took his children captive to Greece. Neptune, like all the immortals, loved more than once, and among those who shared his affections was a maiden named Theophane, who had so many suitors that it kept the jealous sea god in constant fear lest she should prefer some earthly lover. So he took her to the island of Crumissa, and there changed her into a sheep, while he carried on his wooing in the form of a ram. The offspring of this marriage was the famous golden fleeced ram, whose pelt was the object of that ill-fated expedition made by Jason and his fellow Argonauts. Neptune also loved the goddess Ceres, and followed her during the long time that she spent in search of her daughter Proserpina. Ceres was angered by the sea god's persistent wooing, and hoping to escape from him, she took the form of a mare. But Neptune was not so easily discouraged, for he changed himself into a horse and contentedly trotted after her. The child of this strange pair was Arion, a wonderful winged steed that had the power of speech and was of such incredible swiftness that nothing could ever equal it in speed. The most famous children of Neptune and Amphitrite were Triton and Proteus. Triton was his father's trumpeter, and at Neptune's command he blew upon his conch shell to calm the restless sea. His body was half man and half fish, and he gave the name of Tritons to all his male descendants, who, with the Nereids and Oceanides, daughters of Oceanus, followed the chariot of Neptune when he went abroad to view his kingdom. Proteus had charge of the great flock of sea calves which fed on the soft seaweed and basked in the warm sands near his cave. He was celebrated for his wisdom and for the truth of the answers that he gave to those fortunate enough to make him speak. Homer calls him the Ancient of the Deep, whose words are ever true. But his knowledge was not easy to obtain, for he had the extraordinary power of assuming any shape he pleased, and only those mortals gained his advice who persistently clung to him through his many bewildering changes. When the climbing sun has reached the middle heaven, the Ancient of the Deep, who ne'er deceives, emerges from the waves, and, covered with the dark scum of the sea, walks forth, and in a cavern vault lies down. The sea calves from the hoary ocean throng, rank with the bitter odor of the brine, and slumber near him. Then ye must exert your utmost strength to hold him there, although he strive and struggle to escape your hands, for he will try all stratagems, and take the form of every reptile on the earth, and turn to water and to raging flame. But hold him fast until the aged seer is wearied out in spite of all his wiles, then question him. Bryant's Homer Odyssey, Book 4, line 518. Aristeus was the son of Apollo and the water nymph Cyrene. Beside tending his flocks and herds, he took care of the olive trees and vineyards, and was a famous keeper of bees. He was very proud of his hives, and the swarm of bees increased each year under the guidance of his skillful hands. But one day he found hundreds of the bees lying lifeless beside the hives, and on the morrow there were still more among the dead. Not knowing how to account for this disaster, Aristeus hurried to his mother to ask for her help in saving the few bees that remained. Cyrene lived under a mountain stream, and hearing that her son wished to speak to her, she commanded the river to divide and form a wall on either side, so that Aristeus might walk in dry places. When the youth told her of the tragedy befalling his hives, she could not help him, but bade him go to old Proteus, for he alone could tell what the trouble was and find a remedy. She warned Aristeus of the difficulty in holding the Ancient of the Deep when he tried to bewilder and terrify the stranger by rapidly assuming different forms, and she bade him remember that he must keep the sea god fast bound if he would receive the wished for answers. Then she led him to the cave of Proteus and hid him there, exhorting him to be bold and fearless. At noon the wizard of the deep came up out of the sea, followed by his herd of sea calves, and while they lay stretched out on the warm sands, the god sought the retreat of his cave, and soon was in deep slumber. When Aristæus saw Proteus fast asleep, he stepped cautiously up to him and bound him with strong fetters. The god woke with a start and tried to shake himself free of his chains, but on finding that he was a prisoner, he resorted to all the trickery that he could command. He became a fire, a flood, a wild beast, a horrible serpent, and many other forms calculated to terrify the beholder. But Aristæus was not afraid, and soon the old wizard realized that he must submit. So he assumed his own shape and asked the youth what it was that he wished to know. The son of Cyrene told him of the death of his bees, and begged for some remedy. Then Proteus reminded him of how he had been the real cause of Eurydice's death, by making her flee from him in such haste that she did not see the snake at her feet. The wood nymphs, who were Eurydice's companions, had therefore wished to punish Aristæus, and had sent this destruction to his hives. It was necessary to appease the wrath of the nymphs, and to do this Proteus bade the youth build 4 altars and sacrifice on them 4 bulls and 4 cows of perfect form and size. This burnt offering was to placate the nymphs, and when it was made he must pay funeral honors to Orpheus and Eurydice to pacify their anger against him. At the end of 9 days he was to return to the grove where he had made the sacrifices. Aristæus thanked the Ancient of the Deep for his wise words, and after releasing him from the fetters, hurried away to do as Proteus had advised. The sacrifices were made and suitable honors paid to the dead, and then, after waiting impatiently for 9 days, Aristæus went back to the grove. To his great joy he found that a swarm of bees had taken possession of the carcasses, and that he was now the owner of a much larger number than he had ever had before. One of the many sea gods who ruled under Neptune was Glaucus, who was once a poor fisherman and earned his living by selling the fish that he caught each day. One morning he had an extra large haul, and when he threw the fish on the ground beside him, he noticed that they were eagerly nibbling the grass that grew very thickly on the spot where he had flung his net. As he stood watching them, the fish suddenly leapt up from the ground, and having flopped back into the water, swam away. Curious to see whether it was the grass that gave them this extraordinary power, Glaucus chewed a bit of it himself, and immediately he felt an irresistible desire to plunge into the sea. Fearlessly he dived beneath the waves, and soon found no difficulty in keeping under water, for the ocean seemed now to be his native element. He saw his beard turning a lovely sea green, and he found that his hair, grown suddenly long and green, was trailing out behind him. His arms were azure colored, and his legs became a fish's tail, but he felt no regrets over losing his human form, and stayed contentedly in the ocean. In time Neptune made him one of the lesser gods, and took him into the friendly fraternity of the sea. As Glaucus was swimming one day near the shore, he saw a beautiful maiden named Scylla, and fell so much in love with her that he forgot he was half fish, and begged her to be his wife. Scylla stared at his green hair and blue skin, but this did not frighten her, nor did she wonder at his fish's tail, for she had often played with the sea nymphs and was accustomed to their strange appearance. Glaucus felt encouraged by her behavior, and begged her to listen to the story of his life. He told her how he had suffered a sea change and now occupied the lofty position of a god. The maiden was interested in this recital, but she had no desire to marry her merman, even if he were a god. So when Glaucus ventured to come nearer to her, she turned and fled. Discouraged but still determined, the young god sought the aid of the enchantress Circe, and begged her to give him some love potion by which he might win the unwilling Scylla. Circe was so pleased with the handsome sea god that she urged him to accept her love and forget the maiden who scorned him. But Glaucus would not yield to the persuasions of the enchantress, and kept pleading for the desired love potion. Seeing that she could not gain his affections, Circe determined that at least no one else should enjoy his love, so she refused to make the potion and sent Glaucus angrily away. When she saw him go sorrowfully from her palace, she mixed a magic liquid, brewed from poisonous plants and deadly weeds, and this she poured over the waters where Scylla was wont to bathe. The maiden, suspecting no treachery, sought the ocean at her accustomed hour, and as soon as the poisoned waves touched her body, she became a horrible monster with 6 heads, each having 3 rows of sharp teeth. She saw all around her serpents and barking dogs that were part of her own body, which had suddenly become rooted to the spot where she stood. She never regained her human form, but stayed in this place forever to terrify all mariners, and to devour the hapless sailors that came within her reach. Opposite her was the den of Charybdis, who 3 times a day swallowed the waters of the sea, and 3 times threw them up again. On the rock above the den was an immense fir tree, and all ships that passed that way watched eagerly for this signal of danger, and prayed that they might safely steer between the double horrors of Scylla and Charybdis. There Scylla dwells and fills the air with fearful yells, her voice the cry of whelps just littered, but herself a frightful prodigy, a sight which none would care to look on, though he were a god. 12 feet are hers, all shapeless, 6 long necks, a hideous head on each, and triple rows of teeth, close set and many, threatening death. And forth from the dark gulf her heads are thrust, to look abroad upon the rocks for prey. No mariner can boast that he has passed by Scylla with a crew unharmed. Bryant's Homer's Odyssey, Book 12, line 100. 2 other minor deities of the sea were Leucothea and Palæmon. They were not born of the ocean nymphs or any water god, but were once mortals, named Ino and Melicertes. Ino was the wife of King Athamas, whom cruel Juno goaded into madness, and through fear of him Ino fled from the palace with her little son Melicertes in her arms. She hoped to reach some place of safety, but imagining herself pursued, in her frenzy she plunged from a cliff's edge into the sea. Neither she nor her son perished, however, for the gods, in pity for her sufferings, changed them both into ocean deities, under the names of Leucothea and Palæmon. They were widely worshipped by all who had business in great waters, and their protection was invoked against the danger of shipwreck. A famous altar to Palæmon was built on the shores of Corinth, and in his honor were instituted the celebrated Isthmian Games. Neptune was not only willing to befriend a goddess in distress, as he did when he raised the island out of the sea for Latona, but was equally ready to assist mortals, especially in their love affairs. Once he lent his chariot to a youth named Idas when he wished to elope with the maiden Marpessa, whose father had refused to allow the lovers to wed. They were overjoyed at Neptune's kindly offer of assistance, and on the day arranged for their flight the happy pair mounted the chariot, and the swift steeds carried them far out of reach of Marpessa's angry father. When he discovered that his daughter had eloped with her lover, he started in pursuit, but finding it impossible to overtake Neptune's splendid horses, he flew into such a rage that he flung himself into a river and drowned. The river was afterwards called by his name, Evenus. Knowing themselves out of reach of the irate father, the lovers continued their journey very happily, and believed that no misfortune could overtake them, when suddenly Apollo appeared before them, and declaring himself in love with Marpessa, offered to fight Idas, then and there, for the possession of the maiden. Poor Idas felt that his chances for happiness were indeed ended, for how could a mortal contend with an omnipotent god? Suddenly a thunderbolt fell from the blue sky, and a voice declared that Marpessa herself should choose between her 2 suitors. The maiden looked at the glorious sun god, and her heart beat fast at the thought of being loved by one so beautiful and young. But when she turned to Idas, she remembered that he was a mortal like herself, who would grow old as she grew old, and would therefore not cast her aside when her youthful charm was gone, as Apollo would be sure to do as soon as her beauty waned. So she held out her hand to Idas, and refused the sun god's love. The choice was approved by Jupiter, and the lovers, happy once more, urged Neptune's swift horses over the mirror-like sea, which the kindly god had made calm as a forest pool on the softest summer day. In time they reached a pleasant land far from their native country, and here they lived happily ever afterward. The chariot, no longer needed, was sent back to Neptune with many thanks for his timely aid, and each year Idas and Marpessa burned as sacrifices to their protector a white bull, a white ram, and a white boar, which was the kind of offering most pleasing to Neptune. End of chapter 18.